Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Russell Shorto, author of Smalltime.
Russell Shorto, you are the author of a new book called Smalltime, and it is about somebody named Russell Shorto. Just coincidence?
No, that's not a coincidence. It's about my grandfather, who obviously is my namesake, who died in 1981, so a long time ago. And I knew basically my whole life that he was kind of a small-time mob boss in Johnstown, my hometown. And despite the fact that as an adult, I make my living writing history, writing books of narrative history, it was only relatively recently that it occurred to me that this would be a good topic, that this would be worth exploring for personal reasons, but also for history, because among other things, people aren't so aware of the small town mob. You know, for all of the storied, mythicized accounts there have been in books and films of the mob, it's mostly New York and Chicago, and it's a very kind of romanticized story. So I eventually came up with the idea of writing a book about my grandfather that would be a personal family book, and it would be about my town, Johnstown, but it would also be more broadly about the small town mob.
So when you talk about the small town mob, what did that mean then, and what's the period that it covers?
Well, I knew very little about the mob before I went into this. And that's precisely because I had some awareness of my family association with it. And I just felt that this is such, I guess I felt I didn't want to get caught up in a stereotype. So I just avoided it. I didn't watch the Godfather films. I just stayed back. So I've learned a lot since then. And the story in Johnstown, as in Scranton and Easton and Braddock and Altoona and all over the state and all over the country, develops with Prohibition, and it really gets going then after Prohibition, when these Southern Italian immigrants start to look for a new income stream, and they settle on gambling. And so in my story, for my grandfather and his partner, who was his brother-in-law, their heyday was really World War II until the early 60s. It started earlier than that, and it continued somewhat after that. But that was the heyday, and I think that was the heyday of the small town mob in general.
You said that you were vaguely aware of this connection in your family. I mean, were stories told as you were growing up?
You know, I kind of think every family has stories, unsavory things that everybody knows about. And at the same time, everybody knows we're not going to talk about that. And yet, as a kid, you pick it up somehow. Maybe there's some little conversation among the adults that quickly slips by, but you register that. And so I always, that's what I mean. I always knew it, but I also always took in that sense that we don't talk about it, which is, I think, why I didn't until recently think, hey, this is a really fascinating topic to explore.
Did you know your grandfather?
I knew him distantly. I go into this in the book. He was really on the outs by the time I came on the scene. He had one of the issues he had was he was a real serial binge drinker, and that's what got him. Eventually, he either left voluntarily or was kicked out of the business. And so by the time I was aware of things, he was on the outs in that regard, but also with respect to the family. He'd done a lot of damage, psychological damage, and people had kind of pushed him out. He still lived in town, and the memories I have of him were of, one time I was with my mother downtown, and we were walking down the sidewalk, and some old guy in a kind of baggy gray suit is coming up, and I knew who it was right away. And we stopped and talked, and what was memorable about that was he had this heavy wristwatch, and he gave it to me, put it on my wrist. And it was, even in things like that, it seemed to me, that was inappropriate. His gestures were, even as a has-been, he didn't follow the norms. That was kind of my impression of him.
Do you still have the watch?
That's what a good question. I do not. I have to ask my mother what in the world happened to that watch.
Now, when it sounds like from your book, there wasn't a lot written about your grandfather and his business. You had to talk to people. How did you find people who remembered him?
Yeah, in fact, yeah. So what happened was several years ago, I was home visiting at Christmas time, and everybody who stayed in town pretty much kept that notion that we don't talk about that stuff, and it eventually kind of fades, like everything. It happened that the man I'm talking about, my namesake, is my father's father. My mother's cousin had been in town. He was, I didn't know it at the time, but he had been, as a teenager, he was a numbers runner for my grandfather, and he worked in a pool hall. And he was also a jazz musician. So when he was about 20, he finally left town, moved to Las Vegas, and had his whole career there. So this Christmas vacation, when I was home, somebody said, "Oh, Frank is back in town. Let's go see him. He's playing at a local club." And so it turned out he had retired and moved home. And so we went to see him, and there was a break in the sets, and we're all kind of standing around in a circle. And he looks across at me and says, "Russell, I've been meaning to talk to you. What are you going to do about the story? You're the writer." And I said, "What story?" And as soon as I said it, I knew what he was going to say. And he said, "What story? Your grandfather, the mob." And I could feel all these people around me kind of, shrink because, you don't talk about this. But Frank, I think because he had left so early, to him, these were just golden memories of his youth. And he was, all the razzle dazzle and all that stuff. So he kind of popped that bubble, and he got me thinking about it. But then I said to him, "Look, Frank, I write nonfiction. I know those guys didn't leave notebooks lying around. So what am I going to base this on?" So I pushed it away, and he kept pushing back. Frank basically said, "You write history. This is history. This is American history. People don't know this story." So finally, I was curious enough that I said, "All right, I'm going to come back home." This was a year or two later, and I'll spend a week seeing what I can discover. And so he said, "All right." I got home, and I called him, and he said, "All right, meet me at my hangout." His hangout was, and still is, Panera Bread. So we went there, and we sat down, and I turned on the recorder on my phone. And I just thought, he was going to tell me some stories or something. A little old guy comes up. A little while later, another one, and another. Soon there were about 8 guys around us. And, they're leaning on their canes and things. He'd put out the word. So my grandfather and his cohort, those guys were dead and gone. But these were the young guys who had looked up to them, had admired them, hung on their every word. And they had stories. So 4 hours later, I hit stop on the recorder. And I said, "All right, this is something. It's not good enough for me, because these are memories of people who are 80 years old, and I'm not going to just rely on that. But it's definitely something." I was really, when you're researching a story, whatever it is, you can tell when you've lost track of time, and you're just absorbed by it. If someone is telling you a story, you're watching a movie, everything else kind of goes away if it's good enough. So I really felt that. And so then I did what I normally do when I write history, because normally the history books I write are set hundreds of years ago. So, you're in archives. So at the time, my dad was friends with the chief of police in town. He gave me my own key to the records room, which was like a big walk-in closet, really, with all these cardboard boxes that were tumbled down. And I spent days there. I went to the county courthouse and got records, my grandfather's arrest records. I filed FBI Freedom of Information Act requests. So I did that. So and lo and behold, these stories that all these guys were telling me, I could fit them together with this documentary record, and it was making sense. And it was, you start to get this three-dimensional sense of what was going on and how these guys operated. So I committed to the project, and then I ended up doing more than 200 hours of interviews with basically everybody in town who I could talk to who was of a certain age.
What kind of stories did they tell you?
Everything. I mean, there were some people who, the book mixes memoir, really kind of intimate details of the family with how they ran this business. And so some people would talk to me about my father's older cousin, was the bookkeeper for them, for their operation. So she had fascinating information because she had, a handle on the financials, but also could talk about, when Russ, she called him Uncle Russ, when he was drunk, and, then how his personality changed. So people in the family, people in town who knew them, one of my greatest resources was a man named Mike, who it turned out was really my grandfather's protege. And he was almost the son my grandfather didn't have, despite the fact that my father was on the scene. But he differentiated, and I found that really fascinating, that he was keeping my father away from things. But Mike, because he had had a similar upbringing, he had grown up kind of on the streets as my grandfather did. He really took him under his wing. And so Mike, after my grandfather, as I kind of suggested before, was, there was a lot of darkness in him, which I think is related to kind of weakness in his personality. He became very, very successful, and money was just flowing when they were at their height. And I think he didn't know what to do with it. I think it went to his head. And I think that the drinking was part of that. And he became kind of a real womanizer and caused enormous havoc, not just in my family, but beyond. And I think in both of those things were related to that, to this, you're doing a personality study of someone who's given a lot of power and can't handle it.
Was it hard for you to write about some of those things that are very close to you and your family?
Yes, it was. And a lot of people in my family were involved throughout. As I said, I was interviewing them, and my daughter and my stepson both transcribed interviews for me. My other daughter did research for me. I talked endlessly with my parents and other family members about it. So it was almost like a group of us were doing this together. So it wasn't just me deciding, will I go there? Will I talk about this? And fortunately, I come from a big open family. And my father was really my touchstone for this, as he worked with me to try to understand who his father was. His father was the most annoying thing about researching this man, who was my namesake, is that everybody I talked to about him, the first thing they would say when I said, "Tell me about Russ," they would say, "He was very quiet." It's like, you want to find out who this person was, you want to bring him to life again. That's not what you want to hear. So that was a challenge, but it meant that everybody had their little window in, their connection with him. And so what I was trying to do was put all those pieces together to kind of reconstruct this person.
How did he get into the business in the first place?
I think in all ways, pretty much, his story tracks the rise and fall of the mob in America. His parents had emigrated to America from a village in Sicily. They were part of that wave of 4 million people who came from southern Italy to the U.S. answering calls for work. And in their case, this would be my great-grandfather. He went to work in a coal mine in Punxsutawney, and that's where they started. And then they moved to Johnstown. And so my grandfather was born in America, and his parents were subject to that extreme kind of discrimination that these first immigrants were subjected to. There was another kind of discrimination that was in force when my grandfather was coming into being. You lived in kind of ghettoized neighborhoods, not just of Italians, but of Hungarians and Poles and others. And it was very clear that he was not going to go to college or anything like that. So his path was very limited. And he is a teenager during the years of Prohibition. His father died, he was murdered. His mother then had 9 children and doesn't speak English.
She became a bootlegger.
She became a bootlegger. And again, this is part of the dynamic that you see all over the country, particularly. So the organization, kind of the way it worked, and you have to piece this together from different accounts. There was typically a guy who kind of was the boss of the neighborhood, some old Italian guy. And he organized people, and often it was single mothers, to set up a still in their living room. And presumably he gave her a share of the profits. And so my grandfather then is going out on the streets with Coke bottles filled with moonshine and selling them. So that's how he's kind of getting his start. At the same time, these guys in the neighborhood are teaching him cards and dice. And another side of his personality is, he not only became a big operator in gambling, but he was a very good cheat. He was an excellent cheat at cards and dice, and he learned that kind of on the streets. So
I hate to interrupt you because this is fascinating, but speaking of cheating at dice, you mentioned the word skeech, meant to cheat at dice, not by loading them. You had to be able to do it with normal, unadulterated dice. So there's a skill in knowing how to roll dice so you get the roll you want?
That's what the guys told me. And this protege of my grandfather's, who was, let me think, he was 15 or 20, maybe 15 years younger than him. He had been trained by the same old guys who trained my grandfather. And that was how they developed an affinity for each other. And he showed me and taught me, no, he didn't teach me, but he told me in great detail how you can, manipulate the dice so that you can throw a 6 or a 10 or whatever. How often that worked? But I guess it worked often enough that you could, you could beat the odds. My grandfather learns all these skills, and then when Prohibition ends, he moves, as do people all over the country, from Prohibition, from selling illegal alcohol into gambling. So in both cases, you have to think about how moralistic America was. They had this ban on alcohol, and they also, gambling was incredibly, was seen as this terrible evil. And yet it seems everybody wanted to do it. So once again, the mob, as these guys are coming together into this, organized outfit, says, all right, here's a product that everybody wants and nobody's legally allowed to do it. We'll figure out how to provide it. We'll provide this service. So that's what happens. As he comes of age, the first arrest warrants I got for him are for running card and dice games out of the trunk of a car. So that's what he's doing as he's moved out of Prohibition. And again, that's what people are doing. So then the next step in the story is, so my grandfather knows the town. He knows Johnstown, knows all the neighborhoods, knows all the people, knows how to, who wants to gamble, who's into the big games and the small games and the craps games. Another guy had grown up in the Philadelphia mob. And one of the things I find fascinating about the mob in general is how much these guys admired American capitalism, and they emulated it. And so as it was becoming successful, they started to open branch offices. And this guy, in exchange for taking the fall for someone in a counterfeiting charge, they gave him Johnstown, which was then this up and coming booming steel town. So he shows up in town. His name was Joe. They called him Little Joe. And he meets this girl who he eventually marries, who happens to be my grandfather's sister. And so Joe comes bringing the imprimatur, the official franchise, and his brother-in-law knows the town already. He's got it all figured out. So that's how they got together, and they then, it seems pretty systematically, put together a gambling operation that had all sorts of manifestations to it. The heart of it was a numbers game, which they called the GI Bank, which I think is just marvelous PR, because it was really in its heyday. It came into being during and just after the war. So it's like, by calling it the GI Bank, it feels like if you're playing, you're supporting the troops or something. So you got a numbers game, which people told me half the town played. So they had about 100 people working for them, numbers runners, accountants. They had card and dice games. They had card games for the big shots in town, the guys who were the owners of the department stores and the clothing stores and things. They ran something called tip seals, which were very popular then, which was kind of like a lottery. You bought a ticket, and your ticket had a number on it. You immediately, if you bought it for a dime or a dollar, and if the number underneath it matched the number you bought, then you won whatever the bet was. That was very popular. They also were into pinball. Pinball was used for gambling in mid-century America. It was very popular because, and the big innovation was when I think it was 1947, when they started having flippers on the machine. Before that, you spun the ball and it just bounced around the machine. But once you had flippers, it felt like the player could control things a bit. And the way pinball worked as a form of gambling was you won free games. And if once you won so many free games, you would go up to, the pinball machine is in a bar or a cafe or something. You'd go up to the bartender and say, okay, I got 10 free games. And the bartender would pay you for those. And the beauty of that was there's no product. It wasn't like there's a pack of chewing gum or something that the IRS could say, oh, where's our percentage of that sale? So what they did is the outfit split the take with the owner of the establishment that housed the pinball machine. So they had these, many ways that you could lose your money, and many ways really to entertain, because the big aspect of all this is they were providing a public service, which was entertainment. This has everything to do with the fact that this is really before the advent of television. There's this fascinating, I think you could do a really nice inverse comparison of the rise and then decline of the mob and the rise of television in America. It was really in the 50s when they were really going great guns. In 1950, 5% of American households had a TV. By 1960, 90% did. And you really see, and by then, that the heyday of the mob, especially the small town mob in America, was past.
I want to ask you a question. You write in here, back in 1911, the mayor of Johnstown made it a campaign promise that no one of Italian descent would work in his administration, not even as a street cleaner. When your grandfather came along, were Italians still out of the mainstream like that?
Yeah, and I think that that is very much part of the story of the rise of the mob in America. It's, in so many ways, there's the layer of immigration. America wants immigrants. We want people to come in and do all these jobs that Americans didn't want to do. And then there's the next layer, which is discrimination. And there's this huge backlash. As I said, 4 million people from southern Italy come into the country. And then Americans, real Americans, who were mostly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, by 1920 were really up in arms about this. And so what you get then is the return of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan came into being after the Civil War, and it was this anti-Black. I mean, they were afraid of, the uprising of Blacks and they're going to take over. It had completely died out. By 1920, it suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, comes back, and there are Klan chapters all over the country. They're marching with the hoods on and everything in Washington and in New York. And it was anti-Catholic. It was anti-immigrant, and particularly Catholic, because by and large, these immigrant groups were from Catholic countries in Europe. And there was this, I mean, it's hard to imagine now, but there was this very strong fear that, the Pope was behind all this, and he was infiltrating America, and he was going to change, he was out to subvert American values. So that, yes, for people like my grandfather, that's what I meant when I said, as a kid growing up, coming of age, what paths did he have? Everyone knew people like him weren't going to advance along the established channels. And so yet they taught them in school, to admire George Washington, to admire Henry Ford and Frick and Carnegie and all those guys. So in essence, what they did is they tried to copy them, but in their own, along their own path, and with products that they knew people wanted that they could provide.
Did they ever use violence as part of their job?
One of the, I'm writing in this book about the small town mob, and in many ways it mirrors what was going on in big cities, but I think there are some crucial differences, and one is violence. A big city could withstand, first of all, in a big city, the money presumably was on a much higher scale. But a big city could withstand crime. It just gets swallowed up. If people in a town the size of Johnstown, if they started gunning people down, people just couldn't handle that. The authorities would come in, they would crack down on this. So for the most part, in Johnstown and in other places where I've done some research, it was pretty, there was very low level violence. They did a lot of, they had muscle guys who worked for them who would go and smack somebody around because they owed the money or something. And in fact, at the heart of the book, the story that I tell, is a murder of a bookie, which was never solved. And believe it or not, Brian, someone just this morning emailed me from, she is the daughter of, her father had been editor at the Johnstown Tribune Democrat at the time, and she had all this information about this murder. So anyway, you write a book and things, you get all kinds of things come out of it. But this bookie was murdered in 1960, and it really spelled the beginning of the end for Russ and Joe and their operation, because it happened right as Kennedy was coming into the White House, and he brought in his brother, Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General. And, through the 50s, the federal government was trying to say there's no such thing as this nationwide organization that's, that's criminal in intent and so on. By this time, by 1960, everybody knew that was wrong. And Bobby Kennedy came in on a promise to clean up the mob. And in this little town in Pennsylvania, suddenly this bookie is murdered, and it happened in a very dramatic way. He went missing. His body wasn't discovered for 6 or 7 weeks. And so you see in the newspapers, and all my informants, my interview subjects were telling me about this, there was this, where's Pippi? What's going on with Pippi? This is very strange. And his car is still parked on Vine Street. And, so it allows this mystery and this anxiety to build. And then they finally find his body. And then the whole investigation plays out against the backdrop of the Kennedy administration's efforts in Washington. So suddenly you have the Attorney General in Washington corresponding with the mayor of Johnstown, and you've got FBI agents in town. So that really spelled the beginning of the end. That kind of pressure was what started to change things.
Well, when your grandfather was involved in this operation, was it organized? I mean, was crime organized? Was the Johnstown mob in contact with the Pittsburgh mob and the Philadelphia mob, and then were they taking orders from the top, or were they all operating as kind of little pockets?
I think it was both. I've gotten a lot of information from my network, but also from books and from reading through FBI. And by the way, you file a FBI Freedom of Information Act request. It took like more than 4 years to start getting the information, so you have to be patient. But I think it was a little of both. There was a level of organization. There was, Johnstown relationship with Pittsburgh and with Philly, but it was mostly Johnstown to Pittsburgh to New York, apparently. But also they were very aware of their immediate surroundings, of what was going on in Altoona and in New Kensington and in Braddock and in Greensburg. And then there were, they had dealings with people in Atlantic City and in Florida. So yes, there was a network, and yes, at the same time, it seems like they each operated kind of like a medieval warlord, with his own turf that you had to defend.
But did anybody ever try to move in on them, like a neighboring town? Du Bois try to take over the Johnstown mob?
Yes, and I think that happened. I don't know how often, but certainly the circumstances surrounding the death of Pippi DeFalco, the bookie I referred to, that's what the people at the time, the reporters were zeroing in on. And some of the people of my sources told me that that's what they think was going on. It had to do with, Pippi worked sometimes for Russ and Joe, but he ran a sports book. But he would also go out on his own. He had his own customers. And apparently that was allowed. It took me a long time, not having this kind of mentality naturally, to understand that it wasn't the case that everybody in town who had a gambling operation had to work for them. They weren't their employees. You could have your own thing going. But what they did, what the mob did, was they were the ones who paid off the authorities. Their center of their operation on Main Street was called City Cigar, and it was 2 doors from City Hall. It was a cigar shop in front, and there was a door behind it, and you walked in, and there were 10 pool tables and a billiards table, and they had a counter with a ticker tape on it, and that was the nerve center, and everything they did operated on that level.
What kind of relationship did they have with City Hall and with local politicians and local police?
They were, everybody I've talked to over a certain age knew who Russ and Joe were, knew them personally because it's a small town. And they didn't have to actually themselves be in the mob, but they, for the most part, partook of their services. It was normal for people to just play the numbers. They knew what they were doing. They knew where their base was. It was all in the open, and it could be in the open because, first of all, because there was a very low level of violence, so it was tolerable. They were providing something that people wanted, and they kept people happy. They kept the authorities happy. So the mayor supposedly would come. I heard stories he would come in every day around lunchtime and shoot the breeze with them, and presumably would leave with an envelope. They paid off the police. They manipulated the races for district attorney. They so they provided this kind of umbrella, a protective umbrella. And under that, then other people, if they wanted, could operate a card game or something. But in exchange for that, they were supposed to pay them something. So that was the deal. That's how they were really woven into the fabric. So the fabric of the town, and even more than what I'm describing, because in addition to providing this array of gambling services, they would let's say they have pinball machines in your tavern, and you're behind on your rent. Well, they'll pay your rent for the next 6 months or something, and in exchange they'll take a piece of the business, and maybe later down the line they took over the business. So they owned a number of different legitimate businesses. So they were woven into the fabric of things. And again, I can't stress enough how ordinary this was. I'm not talking about Johnstown as some anomaly. This was small, medium-sized town America: Anchorage, Alaska, Butte, Montana, Amarillo, Texas, Fresno, California. It was how the country operated.
So what was so wrong about what they were doing?
Well, the funny thing about researching this and talking to people about it, and they talking to the old guys, and they can't help but get a little bit sort of whispery when they're talking, but then you stop and say, all of this is legal now. People play the lottery. They do, they can gamble on whatever.
Yeah, when you watch television now and see commercials for sports betting on TV, well, and you think about what your grandfather did, what are your thoughts there?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what one of his friends and colleagues talked to me about, how in later years in the 1980s, he by then he had graduated and he was not part of the mob, but he was running his own sports book all up and down the East Coast, and he went to prison for it. And he got out of prison and he said, I was so mad at myself because now I'm looking around, this is all, people are doing this legally. I mean, people are just playing lotteries. I organized my own lottery and I got busted for it, yeah, I mean, it's amazing how history turns. What we're talking about now was once considered so, and people really did think it was just terrible, this behavior, and yet presumably everyone did it. And I think of that same kind of thing in terms of the discrimination that he faced, that my grandfather faced, and then how strange it is now. I mean, they thought of Southern Italians as, because of course in the early 20th century, blacks were a very, very low on the ladder, and Southern Italians were right there. In fact, in some statistics I saw, Southern Italians were paid less than blacks. So you would not say now if your ancestry is Southern Italian, obviously you're going to be discriminated against. There are other people now who are in categories that are discriminated against, although I would hope not quite as openly as was the case then.
I want to read something in your book where you quote Mike Giuliano. He says, Russ once told me, Mike, there's two different kinds of people. With the first, you throw a handful of shit in a guy's face and he knows it's shit. You forget about that guy. You can't make any money off of him. With the other kind, you tell him the shit you're feeding him is ice cream, and he'll believe it. You let him think that, you got him to love the taste of it, and then you take every effing dime he's got.
That's and he told me that, and he was proud. He said, that was one of the most important things I ever learned. And that was and he was, really talking to Mike was so great because he was very open about the philosophy, the psychology of a cheat, of a con man. I mean, almost to the point where I was like, I want to be a con man. I would be the worst con man in the world, but he was trying to, I was talking about him before and how he and my grandfather really bonded, and he understood my grandfather, I think, better than most anyone else who I came across. And One of the things that conclusions that I came to was that my grandfather had to be two different things. One, I think his nature, what he felt most happy with, was being a cheat, was playing. And my dad would describe him as he would watch him when he was a little kid. Before he would go, he knew he was going to go play a big card game that night, and he would spend a couple of hours like practicing on the dining table, dealing from the bottom of the deck and dealing the second card, and just like an athlete, he's warming up. He was very good at it. And at the same time, though, because of the, I guess, accident of circumstances, it happened that his brother-in-law was the guy who brought the mob. And so he had this, he became, like the manager of a company, which means you have responsibility. And I wonder if that kind of responsibility didn't weigh on him and lead him to, some of those problems that he had, like with alcohol.
Did he ever go to jail?
Yeah, he was, I'm trying to think of how many arrests he had. And yes, he went to jail, 7 or 8 arrests, but then they stopped. I don't think he was ever arrested after 1946. And that's when they have figured, it seems that they have figured out then the system, the payoffs and so on. So then what would happen was, and part of the way this operated was, they kept the authorities paid off, and but once in a while they would have to, but people knew what was going on and they knew it was illegal. So once in a while they'd have to bust you. So they would call them and let them know. And they'd say, we're coming Tuesday afternoon or something. And they would come into so then everybody would leave, but they would leave some guy behind, usually an old guy who didn't mind spending a night in prison. And they would leave a handful of betting slips around. So there'd be something for them to find that could be written up in the paper the next day. And then it would start all over again.
First of all, you have your family's pasta recipe in the book.
I do.
What possessed you to do that?
I just thought it was, let me think. That's a good question. I thought, I said in the beginning of the book, I say we weren't overtly over the top Italian. We're just very emotive. And I think I said, aunts who kissed you on the lips and long conversations about spaghetti sauce. Those were the ways we were Italian. And so food still remains an important thing in my family. And things like that, the spaghetti sauce recipe, it has it's kind of a life's blood almost. And it just seemed, I think I put it in a footnote, and I think, and it seemed appropriate. It seemed like an appropriate, I'm not going to talk about how, I'm not talking a lot about this longing for the old country or anything like that. I did an event last night, and the interviewer asked me if, just about being Italian American or, for that matter, Irish American or whatever, is that fading? Are those, those ethnic tendencies fading? And I would say certainly they are. I don't feel that nearly the way my parents did, my parents' generation, and they didn't nearly as much as my grandparents did. And my children, they'll, thanks to this book, I guess they think about it. But by and large, I think, that's in the back of my mind, that there's good and bad to that we're, as a country, kind of losing that kind of, those connections, because, it's unfortunate because there's history and there's food and all of that that's part of it. But then again, of course, there's the, when you have those divisions and you defend them, then you're almost automatically setting up kind of warring camps. So, all that somehow, I guess what I'm saying is this book, it was about my grandfather, it was about the mob, but really, as I got into it, I realized this is the story of American immigration. It's just one take on it, but it's not different, so different from other ethnic groups coming. And it's really history. That's not happening that way now. People aren't people who emigrate now, it's not the same dynamic, and I guess by and large that's a good thing.
Now, on your front cover, you have a quote, "Great history mixed with lovely, lingering memories," and the quote is from Francis Ford Coppola. How did you get Francis Ford Coppola to give your book a blurb?
Well, I would love to say he's an old friend, but that's not true. My editor said, how about if we try to get the book in front of Francis Ford Coppola and see if he'll take a look at it. And she got a dresser, and his assistant said, okay, he'll take a look. And lo and behold, and he actually sent a very nice long blurb that went into all these details, which I thought were nice because he pointed out the pinball machines and the tip seals. And I mean, I could almost see a director thinking, looking at certain details and saying, these are the things that jump out at him. So I was incredibly grateful.
Now, you mentioned the newspapers in town. What kind of articles did you find that the newspapers covering your grandfather's business?
Well, in their heyday, they didn't cover it because of precisely what I'm talking about. But there's, towns all over the country used to have, typically they would have your daily paper, and they would have a weekly. And the weekly was a little bit more of a gossip thing. And so the Johnstown Observer, when I hit on that was a really great source because they had a what's going on about town section. And they would report some of these things. They would report, periodically they'd say, why are the, and that was one of the sources that reinforced things that my living sources were telling me. They would say, why are the authorities doing nothing about what they're doing at the cigar shop? And they would come right out and say it, and then you wouldn't see it again for a while. And then with the murder of the bookie, once he went missing, it's the Observer, it's that paper where you start to see this, hey, what happened to Pippi? Where did, why is nobody, are the police investigating? And so they were on that more quickly than the daily paper was.
You say in here, one of the newspapers, Martin, said his newspaper was now being threatened, not by mobsters, but by Johnstown businessmen. The paper was warned that if we didn't lay off the Pippi case and forget it, we would lose some advertising business.
Which speaks to, that's the Observer, the weekly. And this guy, Larry Martin, seemed to be a really intrepid editor and reporter. And that's what I mean by how much a part of things it was, the business, the operation. And people were used to it, provided the money was spread around, then this is how we operate. And all I have the evidence for that is what you just read, some things like that and other things like it, where the newspaper is saying, we have been threatened with advertising, that they would pull advertising if we didn't stop working on it, if we didn't stop digging into this. And this is that's part of the reason that why I talk about that particular murder as the thing that starts to make this whole thing come unraveled.
You also write about an issue of the Johnstown Tribune Democrat that is missing, like all the copies were destroyed.
Yeah, 1971. 71, thank you. So things evolve slowly when it comes to this kind of change, where for years and years, this system exists where they operate and they do their payoffs and everybody's kind of in on it. Then around the time, and partly thanks to this murder, everything starts to change in the country as well. But that's 1960, and it takes a long time for that change to really manifest and to work its way through the system. And what's happening over the course of the 60s is this is becoming more and more integrated into the bureaucracy of law enforcement. And so then in 1971, you get the Pennsylvania Crime Commission, which issues a very detailed report on crime in cities. Basically, they're opening the lid on what I'm talking about that was happening in cities all over the state, and they conduct trials, testimonials of people in different cities, and their report then comes out, and the Johnstown newspaper, the Tribune Democrat, publishes the whole thing. in that day's paper, which was a remarkable thing. And people told me that little Joe, I mean, because he, up until that time, he was, then this is my great uncle I'm talking about. He was, a respected and respectable businessman in town. That was the persona. You didn't, what we're talking about now, the way I'm talking about it, you didn't use words like mob and things like that. And suddenly the whole paper is filled with their doings, and it is calling him names, saying he's a criminal. And people told me he bought up he went away, somehow he bought up every issue of the paper. And I have not found a single issue of it. And the Tribune Democrat today was very helpful with me. I was in their archives many times and did a lot of digging around, and the editor, Chip Minnemeyer, is a great guy who helped me a lot. They searched their files. That day is missing. It's not on the microfilm. They don't have it. So he was pretty thorough.
Did your father ever get involved in his father's business?
That is, you're getting at something that's right at the center of the book. And we're mostly talking about history here. But the book also is very much memoir and family story. And what I get to at a certain point in the book is I grew up somehow with this notion that that my grandfather had wanted to bring his son, my father, into the business, and that my father had resisted. And I also grew up with this notion that he resisted for us. He had this young family, and he was building a wall. He was protecting us from the dark side. And my grandfather, I knew, when I was really little, I knew him as this dark figure, and it just all fit. Okay, he's protecting us from that. From talking to some of these guys who had worked for my grandfather, it slowly penetrated my brain that, in fact, that wasn't the case. And in fact, my father had, and by the way, you have to understand, my father was doing the research on the book with me. He was helping me. He would call up a guy and say, hey, we're just talking about you. We're going to come over, and so we'd go and, shoot the breeze. And so he's working with me on this. And then some of these guys start to tell me, no, your father wanted in. He desperately wanted in as a teenager. And his father, Russ, if he caught him hanging around City Cigar, would beat the crap out of him. And it took me a while to process that, and it took me a couple of years after hearing this and hearing it from a number of people before I could bring it up to my dad. Even though we're working on this. So that's what I mean. I get into all this in the book because I start in the book. I mean, I'm in Sicily, and then I'm with my grandfather in Johnstown. I'm building this operation. And then suddenly my dad, who's helping me uncover all this, suddenly we're kind of looking at each other in my parents' dining room and saying, and I'm like, well, I'm almost saying, who are you? And it turned out that, yeah, he had wanted in, and his father violently rejected him. And my dad then actually joined a gang, and it was a pretty violent gang for a while. And I clearly see this now. It was this father-son dynamic. Because my grandfather didn't say, look, I didn't have much choice when I was growing up, but now things are different. You're not discriminated against in the same way. You have a lot more opportunities. You don't need this. He didn't say. If he had just said that, I think their relationship would have been different. But instead, they lived in the same town most of their lives and didn't speak to each other. They just formed these real, hardened antipathies. So I get into that kind of thing in the book because it does, I write narrative history. Most of the time I'm writing about things that happened hundreds of years ago, but it really does come down to people and those kind of emotional forces between people, between a father and a son, or history isn't just names and dates, And when doing the big revelation for me doing this book was that when you're doing family history, you're still doing history, and it's strange to see. You don't have to be named, Kennedy or something to say my family is in history and is changing history. I mean, you can actually see that.
If you could talk to your grandfather, what would you ask him?
Who killed Pippi? No, I don't. I think I would. What I was just going over there for a few minutes, if I could sit down with my father and grandfather. My father died, unfortunately, while we were nearing the end of the time on the book. And if I could sit down with both of them and say, look, isn't this the case? Isn't this what the problem was? And to have caused such a hardened divide in a family, and all in the same town, over something as ridiculous as an inability to communicate seems like a tragedy.
We have about 1 minute left. What are your other books?
The Island at the Center of the World is what I'm known for, probably most. It's about the Dutch founding of New York. And I argue that New York is New York because it was founded by the Dutch. They brought diversity and they brought free trade, and that's New York. My last book is called Revolution Song. It's about the American Revolution. It's 6 people's lives, very different backgrounds: a slave, a Native American, George Washington, a woman who's the daughter of a British officer, and all their lives kind of woven together, and through that telling the story of the revolution.
Well, we've been speaking with Russell Shorto. His latest book is Smalltime, the story of my family and the mob in Johnstown. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Brian.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.